Greetings, friends of liberty. In March of 2025, Educator Deb Fillman of the YouTube channel The Reason We Learn published a video entitled, "No, You Can't Teach Empathy." In that video and in its comments section, she claimed that while children can learn how to have and use empathy, empathy can't be explicitly taught to them. Is this true? In order to see, let's examine first what empathy is, and then the various claims Ms. Fillman advances in her 45-minute video. Number one, what is empathy? Empathy is the psychological practice, method, or process of one person either understanding another or evoking in themselves the emotions or feelings that another person, either real or hypothetical, feels in any given situation. Empathy formation is thus often understood as having two phases: cognitive empathy, when you try to understand the other person, his personal psychology, situation, and circumstance, and emotional empathy, when you feel what they feel, sometimes as a direct result of having first achieved cognitive empathy. Examples of cognitive empathy would be when you inquire at length to the details of a friend's breakup. Emotional empathy would be when you feel the anger they do at the way they've been treated during that breakup. Another example would be when, watching a person unsuccessfully try to eat a fried grasshopper, you feel the same physical and emotional disgust they do as they vomit the half-chewed grasshopper, legs, abdomen, and all, back onto their plate. In contrast, many people in Africa would not feel disgust since they find fried grasshoppers with a side of onions delicious. Empathy is to be distinguished from sympathy, which is a passive concern for the plight of others. Sympathy generally does not imply an urge to help, whereas compassion does. But sympathy usually does imply that you share ethical values with the other person. Otherwise, you wouldn't feel sympathy for them. For example, no one, apart from Jew-hating Nazis, feels sympathy for the fate of Adolf Hitler because they don't share his values. Empathy, then, is a psychological tool like running is a physical tool. So you could run under the beach and into the water to save a child from drowning, good, or run away from a crime you've just committed, bad. Running and empathy, both cognitive and emotional, are neutral. They're just tools that can be used for good or bad. So con men often are very good at feeling empathy for others, this facilitating their deception. Number two, Miss Fillman's approach. A. Miss Fillman begins the video by arguing that a positive, strong attachment of the child to the parents is a necessary precondition to feeling empathy. She says, the more secure their attachments, the more readily their needs were met, the more capable they are of the personal emotional vulnerability that it requires to feel empathy. B, she then distinguishes correctly between sympathy and empathy, saying sympathy is not empathy, but instead is feeling sorry about another person's misfortune, and that's normal. There's nothing wrong with that. C, she says not only that empathy requires you to give someone something of yourself, it requires you to access in your mind similar emotions to what that person is feeling, which means you had an experience similar to that. And now you're going to allow yourself to go back in your mind and remember that experience, remember the pain, remember what that felt like, which a lot of people don't want to do. It's not pleasant, but if you really care about someone or love them, you'll do it because you know that's probably going to be more helpful to them in that moment than if you just showed sympathy. Let's examine these statements. Remembering the experience, remembering the pain, remembering what it felt like is one way of doing empathy. And it's the way that Konstantin Stanislavski, the great Russian actor and theater director, initially tried. However, eventually he and other theorists like Sanford Meisner and Stella Adler abandoned this technique because, as they discovered over time, A, remembering your own specific experiences gets in the way of imagining the other person's experiences. B, it's unnecessarily stressful and traumatic. And C, it's often not as accurate in its understanding because you're remembering your own experiences, not the other person's. So for these three reasons, remembering traumatic experiences is an inferior technique in many cases. For example, if you lost a parent with Alzheimer's after taking care of them for many years, you're naturally sad that they've died, but you're also probably understandably relieved that the strain and enormous burden of taking care of them when they can hardly function as human beings anymore is finally over. That feeling, your feeling, is going to be very different from someone who unexpectedly and tragically lost a parent who was healthy and much younger. So imagining their situation is again better than remembering your own. D. Note specifically that she may imply here that if kids have healthy attachments, then they can offer empathy to others. But would mere attachment really be enough? First, research shows that not just by modeling kindness, but often by being more direct and instructing kids by asking them, for example, how they would feel if someone else did that to them, you can teach them what empathy is. Furthermore, in my own experience, my ability to empathize with others, despite having great attachment to my own parents, was relatively bad until around 2011. I actually explicitly taught myself how to use more direct methods that my parents hardly ever utilized. So I had to teach myself later what they should have done earlier. Number 3. At this point, about a quarter of the way into the video, at the 11-minute mark, Ms. Fillman changes focus and starts outlining the many ways that modern American K-12 school systems try to teach empathy, specifically often using the doctrine of social emotional learning, or SEL. She offers many criticisms of this approach by describing their methods and by giving personal examples. So, for example, she describes at length how schools try to pressure kids to conform to adopting certain values, like by asking them, "What are your pronouns?" They then, often saying, "Yeah, I know it says you're a boy or girl. That's what you were assigned at birth. And that might not be true. You can choose whatever you want to be." What is the effect on kids of this? Of course, the kids see flags, they see swag, they see all these kinds of rewards for being something other than what they thought they were already. What happens? Doubt, or a sense of confusion. Mom and dad said it was this. This is weird. They've been told, be good, follow the rules, and they're told explicitly how they should feel about this new information. What is her opinion of this? That's not teaching empathy. She means here that the teacher is not modeling empathy. That's not at all recognizing the place where that child is in that moment. They're cosplaying empathy. They do this whole acceptance theater. That's just a kind of conformity to a new value set. So she's pointing out and describing this approach that often cloaks itself in the language of empathy, tolerance, and acceptance. This approach and the teachers who use it often have no cognitive empathy or understanding for the children under their control and in their power. Number 4. Now, at this point and later on, she mentions the issue of grooming, made famous by the social media bans on James Lindsay on Twitter and Reddit. Ms. Fillman agrees with Lindsay that grooming is happening in schools, partly because kids are rewarded, like lab mice getting a food pellet, when they react the way that the instructors want them to react. But with the kids, they often use peer pressure, teacher approval, and love bombing. But as bad as this is, and as much as it should be discontinued, is this technically grooming? Probably not exactly, since cult or sexual grooming is done for the personal advantage of the person doing the grooming or for the benefit of his group or cult leader. So that would usually imply the person or a small cult is getting some direct personal advantage, either sexual or otherwise, from treating kids this way. But the reality is that in most circumstances in schools, there's no personal advantage accrued. How then instead should we describe what's happening? Most likely is indoctrination or brainwashing of kids by using methods that work with them, appropriate to their age level. She continues, saying with regard to these brainwashing teachers, that is manipulation, that is grooming, and the product of that can't possibly be empathy. You deny someone their agency, you're the farthest thing from empathetic. So you can't even teach it to other people because you can't even model it. What decent parent doesn't want their kid to be an empathetic human being, a compassionate human being? She's right. Number 5. Deb next makes the good point that it's wrong for SEL programs, given that kids have a right to privacy or might be having a bad day, to expect them to always talk about or share their feelings in class to demonstrate empathy for others. As she says, it's true that you don't owe them a piece of yourself. She also points out that the kids with healthy attachment tend to go out in the world assuming benign intent, assuming the best of people, and they're about to have that sucked out of them. They then internalize all that negativity. She gives the example of the daughter of a friend, showing how her worldview and character was damaged and her psychology changed into holding woke values. Number 6. Deb next claims at the 29-25 mark that there is no such thing as an empath. She admitting, however, that you have people who are more or less emotionally sensitive, emotionally reactive, but that's not the same thing. Some of the most empathetic people I've known, some of the most truly caring, giving, kind people were some of the last people you would expect it from. People who are ordinarily fairly reserved. There are really 2 issues she's discussing here. A, the ability and sensitivity of people to feel the emotions of others, in other words, receptivity to emotional empathy. And B, whether people can have compassion and concern without feeling emotional empathy. Let's address both issues. A, emotional sensitivity and the readiness to feel other people's feelings. Debbie using empathy here in a broad, constructive sense, equivalent to caring and compassion. But the technical definition of emotional empathy is not that. It's not a good thing. Again, it's just neutral, feeling what others feel. And so psychologists like Simon Baron-Cohen have devised an empathy quotient from 0 to 6, with 6 being a very strong empath. What are people like who consistently measure a 6 out of 6? Usually they're women, and sometimes, as in the case of a psychologist that Baron-Cohen profiles, can be happy and effective. But at other times, we find these empaths not at all happy, being often overprotective of others, very comfortable giving emotional support, but not getting it, and often obsessing about other people's problems, sometimes for days on end. This type of person can also have health problems since they worry so much about others, they're less likely to care for themselves. B, can we feel compassion and concern without feeling emotional empathy? Absolutely. Ms. Fillman gives an example. As an example, describes relatives who, during her stepmother's stay in hospice, as she lay dying, didn't show a lot of emotion, but who were nonetheless very caring and in the end much more comforting to her stepmother than those who put on an emotional display or expressed lots of feeling. I would agree with Deb that these more reserved people had or used cognitive empathy to see her mother's point of view, and because they did, they had more compassion and ability to care for her dying mother. Number 7. Finally, after talking more about the harms of social-emotional learning, she calling it weaponized altruism, then talking even further about the case of James Lindsay, who was banned along with the word groomer itself. She then finally comes full circle and returns to her own method of trying to indirectly help kids learn about acquiring empathy without apparently teaching it. How does she do this? By having kids read complex stories outside of their experience and then have a debate back and forth about what they think it means. I want them to come up with themes on their own and come up with what they think the author was trying to tell them personally. She ends up saying with a smile that that person is teaching empathy. But this would be an indirect method of teaching empathy. It's not necessarily, at least as she describes it, focusing per se on giving the children a cognitive understanding of the point of view of the characters and why they think and feel as they do. It's just letting the discussion flow. Nor is it imagining or articulating how the student himself would feel if they were in the character's place. But that's all possible. In conclusion, let's review what Ms. Fillman got right and what wrong. Number 1, she hasn't provided the slightest evidence that you can't teach either cognitive or emotional empathy. Any good acting school or conservatory like those run or based on the teachings of Stanislavski, Meissner, or Adler did and do just that every day. Being an actor means understanding the mental outlook and motivations of a given character and articulating that very explicitly. And when that point of view is absorbed by the actor, then emotional empathy follows. They can play the role. The whole profession of acting, done correctly, invalidates Miss Fillman's claim. In addition, anytime we ask someone, how would you feel if, we're prompting them to feel emotional empathy and teaching them, if they haven't already learned it, how to use it in understanding others. Parents do it with kids all the time. How would you feel if Johnny took the toy 747 you love so much and broke it when he came over here to visit us? Then the kid would realize, very potentially. Number 2, she claims or implies that all you need to do for kids to learn empathy, since according to her you can't teach it explicitly, is for them, A, to get a good attachment to their parents, B, for parents and teachers to model it, and then C, for kids to participate in very indirect discussions about stories and novels. This too is false, as my own personal example proves, at least to me. Many bad consequences for me could have been avoided if my parents had actively taught me about acquiring cognitive and emotional empathy. It wouldn't have been hard, but they didn't do it. Number 3, she doesn't understand that the best way to feel empathy, the most accurate and least stressful, is to use your imagination, not to try to deliberately recall your own memories or similar experiences, even though this method can function to some degree and in some situations. Using your imagination, again, is what the great pioneers of acting, Stanislavski, Meissner, and Adler, discovered and demonstrated in their classes and schools throughout the entire 20th century. Number 4, the issue of grooming, which he believes occurs in SEL, at least at times, is complicated. While it's true that the method sometimes used on children can resemble that of grooming, the context of sexual and cult grooming, which is done to benefit a small group or its leaders, is overwhelmingly absent. A better term would be the brainwashing or indoctrination of kids, using methods adapted to children. As horrible and psychologically destructive as this is, it wouldn't be grooming because the teachers aren't deriving a personal benefit. Number 5, she's right in showing how, as in the example of her dying mother, people who have cognitive empathy for another can use that to show compassion and concern without feeling or showing much emotional empathy. Number 6, she's also right to point out and understands, I suspect, quite correctly, how bad social emotional learning combined with the emphasis on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, can be in damaging kids' character, emotional and mental health, and outlook for many years to come. She's very right to warn about this, and a significant portion of the video is dedicated to describing these practices. And so there we have it. A, you can teach empathy directly, more directly than Ms. Fillman seems to imply. B, to be clear, parental attachment and modeling itself is not necessarily enough. C, generally use your imagination, not your memories, to understand other people and achieve cognitive empathy. D, yes, SEL doctrine combined with DEI often damages the ability of kids to understand others and to be happy and well-adjusted. And E, lots of compassion and concern can be shown to suffering people without feeling, and perhaps because we don't feel emotional empathy. Happy for my part, here in late 18th century England, we have more cognitive empathy per capita than any country in Europe. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.